One of the more intriguing streets in York is Goodramgate, a Viking name possibly after King Guthrum. At one end is Monk Bar, one of the four main gateways into the city, nowadays home to the Richard III Museum. At the other end is the world-famous Hog Roast, which became well known a few years ago after its Yorkshire pudding wraps went viral on the interwebs. Between the two is Lady Row, which historic England describe as some of the earliest urban vernacular building surviving in England. Not so far from Lady Row is the entrance to the Holy Trinity Church. This delightful little medieval building sits in its own quiet grounds just off Goodramgate. Apparently, several people have, on occasion, witnessed the apparition of a nun wandering the graveyard, sometimes reciting the Lord's Prayer. No one knows her story, but perhaps she's there trying to help another visitor to the site who is much more famous. Thomas Percy, the 7th Earl of Northumberland, is someone that I also talk about on my Ghost Keeper tour, whilst on the Shambles. Being a staunch Catholic, Percy was opposed to the rule of Queen Elizabeth I, who was, of course, a Protestant. Good Queen Bess, as she was nicknamed, said that if anyone were to rebel against her, she would chop their head right off. But perhaps not quite like that. But then he did rebel against her, that is, and so she did chop off his head, that is. Not herself, of course. They had people to do that sort of thing. Yuck. The execution was carried out in York, and it is claimed that his head was buried in the Holy Trinity graveyard. People claim they have seen him, headless, in 16th century clothing, staggering around, trying to find his head. A bit difficult when you can't see anything. However, perhaps the nun, as I intimated earlier, is there to give him a hand looking for his head. Who knows? Couldn't do any harm. Sorry. Nearby is the old White Swan Inn, where a strange group of ghostly figures have been seen standing around an open fire, sharing secretive stories and laughing between themselves. Witnesses have speculated that they might be the ghosts of a few anonymous locals, or that they could be conspirators to some historic plot. Considering that the old White Swan used to be a coaching inn, either explanation could be possible. Yet there have been occasions where chairs that were randomly placed throughout the room have been inexplicably rearranged in a semicircle around the fire, as if for a formal meeting, the fire having lit itself. Even more strangely, when staff once tried to rectify the seating, the chairs flew around briefly before clattering to the floor. There are many other pubs on Goodramgate, including the Golden Slipper, parts of which date back to the 1300s. Apparently a medieval leather slipper was once uncovered there, which had been built into a wall to ward off evil spirits. The shoe is, to this day, in there, on display, presumably still doing its job. The Golden Slipper is one of several pubs in York which had a coffin drop, which enabled dead bodies to leave the premises, not of their own accord, of course, without going through the front door, which would have been considered bad luck. The slipper has its own ghost, nicknamed George, who is presumably a good spirit rather than an evil one. Next door is another former coaching inn, nowadays called the Royal Oak. The interior of the building goes back to the 1400s, but it is believed that there has been a structure on that spot since Viking times. Witnesses have reported several ghosts here, children playing by the fire, a thin, wizened man in the back room, and a rather brash-looking lady in the front room, which some claim to be, well, no lady at all. Perhaps a businesswoman from earlier times. In addition, there have been two other ghostly women seen on the floors above, which observers have named Alice and Mary. Little is known about these apparitions. But further down the street is a building which has rather more of a background to its hauntings. The Snickelways Inn, formerly known as the Anglers Arms, is one of several pubs in York which claim to be the most haunted pub in York, and it certainly has a case. Formerly used as a storehouse for gunpowder and as a house of ill repute, it dates back to the reign of Richard III and was renovated in Elizabethan times. It has had many ghostly sightings over the years, including that of a man in Elizabethan clothing standing behind the bar, a little girl of 4 years old who had a tragic accident apparently involving a brewer's dray, and an old man who disappears and appears on the stairs, and a woman called Mrs. Tulliver who is often seen with a phantom cat. There have been many occurrences of poltergeist activity, such as various tools being thrown around at staff whilst in the cellars. Less alarming, but potentially more gruesome, are the frequent instances of the scent of lavender permeating the premises, sometimes overpoweringly so. Considering that lavender was often used during outbreaks of the plague in order to cover up the smell of the dead, this is perhaps not as pleasant an experience as one might think. However, it is our final story which is perhaps the most tragic. The name Marmaduke Buckle may seem a rather odd one, maybe even made up. Yet there have been several recorded Marmaduke Buckles in York over the years, so not so unusual after all. This particular Marmaduke was born in the late 1600s to a relatively wealthy family who lived next door to the Snickleways, in the building which now houses La Piazza. How lucky to be born into money in those days, you might think. Yet it seems that poor Marmaduke was also unlucky enough to be physically disabled in a way that gave the local bullies cause to ridicule and ostracize him. As time went on, he avoided contact with people as much as he could, hiding in his room and only coming out at night, when he could stroll up and down the street unmolested. One day his misery became too much for him. He carved his name and the years of his birth and the current year into a beam in his upstairs room, passed a rope over the beam and hanged himself. The inscription is still there: Marmaduke Buckle, 1697-1715. Yes, he was only 18 years old when he took his own life. Nowadays he apparently manifests himself by wandering between both buildings, slamming doors and flicking light switches, and, perhaps more poignantly, is sometimes seen late at night, when it's quiet, standing in the street and gazing wistfully along Goodramgate. What a terrible waste is suicide. Who knows what potential we might have in the future, what achievements there might be to come if a little stroke of luck comes your way. Besides which, what I always say is, just don't give your enemies the satisfaction.